you all has anybody else had a chance to review it? Okay, online. Okay, good. So I tried to write this in a way that if you didn't see the first part, you missed out on Alethea's formation and a lot of women's history that I crammed in there because I like to cram women's history down people's throats. But today we're going to be talking, or I'm going to be talking to you more in Alethea's own works. There are a lot of, because the first two. Okay. So Aletheia, as my friend pointed out to me, I had mentioned in my last talk that Aletheia stuffs tons of papers into trunks and hat boxes in her attic at 5 Dexter Place, and those were the documents that I largely used to write about her, and then I didn't use them. Speaking to Rand Edmondson. But today, I have crammed my talk full of Alethea's own works, so I hope you get a sense of who she was. So, when last we met our heroine, Miss Aletheia Patterson, she had just secured, a certificate in motor mechanics from the Mount Pleasant Garage, upstate New York. She studied maintenance there, and she had demonstrated her expertise in driving a wide variety of vehicles, which you can see from the list. Can everybody read that? Okay. The list her teacher included in the certificate he wrote for her gives us just a small sample of how many of these car wrecks have disappeared over the century. Then Aletheia left upstate New York and returned to Cincinnati, packed bags, and sailed for France. It was 1919. The war, World War I, was over, but she was gone. The United States had entered the Great War, the First World War, the war to end all wars, in its last year, in 1918. Aletheia had hoped to make a contribution to the war effort through her training, but with the war over, she could have stayed home. Instead, she decided to go to France anyway. She seems to have been destined to go. On a prophetic day in June of 1904, when she had been traveling in Germany on one of those many trips post-graduation that we talked about in the last lecture, she had witnessed a parade in which the Kaiser had led more than 10,000 men. She had no way of knowing on that day in 1904, of course, how much the Kaiser's future would affect her own. But Alethea's sojourn in France at the end of World War I was the beginning of more than a quarter century of her living overseas. Another letter of recommendation from Alethea's paper shows us that she had lived for at least a few months in France by the early summer of 1919. There she had served as a chauffeuse to the medical director, who appears to have been a woman, Marie-Louise Dufour, of the American Memorial Hospital. Technically, she was driving for the American Fund for French Wounded. This is not Aletheia. Which was operated by the hospital. And she was not alone in her unconventional work. In 1919, European women worked in munitions, as firemen, mechanics, and laboratory workers, among many other occupations. An Associated Press clipping in Alethea's papers showed a photograph with this caption: American women truck drivers prove efficiency in France. Draw great army lorry out of ditch after its chauffeur proves he is unable even to start the engine. Now, this cartoon is actually from World War II, but I think it's a good reminder, and this was in Alethea's papers, so she enjoyed this. It reminds us that the rivalry between men and women and who's the better driver or who's competent is a very, very old one. This is not, I forgot my mouse. This is not really smooth way to transition. Okay. of two women, one who was a professional car tester, taking a Model T out and showing what it can do, even in terrible weather in Michigan. Okay, so in June of 1919, Aletheia left Paris for Poland. The assignment came from her new employer. Sorry, my laptop's really glitchy. The assignment came from her new employer, the YMCA, under orders from General Pershing. The trip was short but influential. By the end of July, she was on her way back to Poland in a car, and this time with her brother Jack. You may recall from the previous talk about Aletheia's childhood that Jack was commonly the subject of scathing rebukes from her while she was in college. Most of them were just found to writing her back from Cincinnati. But in the very early days of aviation, Jack was busy. He secured a pilot's license, a single-digit license. He was one of the first 10 people to get one, demonstrating how quickly he had jumped into a plane after their invention. When World War I broke out and he tried to volunteer for the spanking new Army Air Force, he failed the physical, and they wouldn't accept it. But undaunted, he left for Europe just like his sister had, and by the fall, the two were on their way to the front during the Russo-Polish War to volunteer to help the Poles. This war had spilled over from the Bolshevik Revolution, and it was the fierce fight of the Poles that ultimately solidified Polish independence and may have stopped, actually, the Bolsheviks from running over Germany as well. This is her Polish passport. Headline: Cincinnati girl in trenches on Polish front. Miss Aletheia Patterson with women soldiers defending their country. Captain John W. Jack Patterson and his sister, Miss Aletheia Patterson, son and daughter of the late Governor John M. Patterson, are believed by their friends in Cincinnati to be in the thick of the fighting between the Poles and the Bolsheviki in the region of Minsk. Dispatches received by the Associated Press Friday from Warsaw state that one American has been killed and another is missing. This is a group of soldiers in the Polish army with some hints of their Air Force writing on. This is a photograph from the Imperial War Museum photography collection. Now in Poland, Jack was flying with the Kosciuszko squadron of aviators, part of the Polish Air Force. Aletheia used the commercial driver's license she had been issued by the French military to distribute supplies in a Ford khaki for the YMCA. Now, I tried to find a Ford khaki, and I'm really not sure. I did not find, this is another example of one of the women ambulance drivers in France in this period. But I am not sure exactly what a Ford khaki was. This may have been one. I don't find this reference, and the internet is very difficult when I typed in khaki because it just brought up all sorts of khakis and things like this. And I gave it a valiant try. This is an ambulance of the period, obviously a Model T converted to an ambulance, and this may have been exactly what she was referring to. She was delivering supplies to the female soldiers who occupied the trenches on the front defending Vilna and Poland. By 1920, Aletheia was working at what she referred to as a kulczenica. I have never found a reference to this again, and it very much seems like Italian to me, not Polish. But the term was to represent a railroad canteen, or as its workers referred to it, anti-YMCA. She was attached to Canteen Number 1, a surgical train, with 5 cars, a passenger sleeping coach, and 4 boxcars, one of which served coffee, tea, or their favorite good cocoa. And the others as a library, social cars. Now this is from a letter in 1920 she wrote home. Writing and game tables were set up where canteen workers sold bread and chocolate. These are Aletheia's words. On bright days, the tables are brought out in front of the cars, and the soldiers cluster around them to write their letters home. Meanwhile, and all the while, even early in the morning, the cheery phonograph plays, now Polish and now American airs. It is quite enchanting and inspiring to be summoned to, quote, rally around the the chief is always played through twice. Life in wartime Poland was a romantic one for Aletheia. She wrote flattering, colorful accounts of a dashing captain, an American who spoke Polish, and who survived several narrow escapes, according to her narratives. Alethea's time in Poland inspired an important development in her career. Like her brother, she began to contribute articles and pictures from the war in Poland to the Cincinnati Enquirer. Her first submission told of the hardships inflicted on the people of Ukraine by the Bolsheviks and Ukrainian bravery in the face of them. The story is especially important because it highlights Alethea's other heroes, those most often forgotten by journalists and later historians. Ukrainian Girl and the Bolsheviki, her article of Sunday, May 15, 1921 began, "The girls of Poland are of the same heroic material as the soldiers." The article tells the story of Rina, a Polish girl, whose house was searched by the Bolsheviki after her father had been taken into custody, during which search incriminating evidence was planted there. As an officer feigning scouring the bedroom, Rina observed his reflection in the mirror as he dropped a revolver into a hat box atop a wardrobe. That story goes on to tell of how Rina basically argued with these guys to get out of being arrested with this planted evidence. Aletheia was attracted to women who assumed stereotypically male roles, whether they had done so voluntarily or because circumstances forced their hands. The Legia Colette of Vilna, or women's legion, had many heroines, but the special favorite of Alethia's was Josefa Singer Zapinska, who had been a soldier for 5 years, first in disguise as Anne, but later discarded the disguise when the Legia Colette was formed. At the age of 15, dressed as a boy, she accompanied her father, leaving their little village in Lithuania to join the Polish soldiery. Except for the commandant, no one knew that this soldier was really a girl. The battalion had been organized by Vilna after much opposition, though by this time the military was convinced of the usefulness of the legion. Partly owing to the shortage of men soldiers, and partly to the girls' proved efficiency, they were used in Vilna in peace times for guard and picket duty. I often saw the details marching to their posts, guns on shoulders, early in the morning or at night. At other times, I would see them on duty, their guns slung at their backs, watching with observant eyes everyone and all that was going on, or halting anyone who aroused their suspicion. They had orders to stand no nonsense and to allow no one they were distrustful of to come nearer than 30 paces, and to shoot if needed. Josefa, not many days before, had disarmed a drunken soldier who was trying to threaten one of the girls. The girls of the Legia Colette, unlike many of the male sentries, were always at their posts and were never known to drink nor to steal. Here she is in her Polish uniform. Alethia's writing reflects her particular admiration for women who challenge traditional concepts of gender roles. The more dramatically, the better. Here's Alethia's words. The band not having come, Janina and the French-speaking girl played the piano, and the rest of us watched 2 soldiers boxing. As soon as the pair had finished, Josefa begged to try it. Uli and I laced the gloves, and Jan volunteered to be her opponent, whilst Mr. L stood by to explain and give her a few hints. She did well for the first attempt, though she soon got out of breath on account of an old wound in her lungs. Every time she came up to the gospoda, a Polish term for an inn or tavern, she would get someone to box with her. They told her that if she wanted to excel, she must give up smoking and drink load of her. For, like most Polish girls, she adored cigarettes. The fighting in Poland in the early 1920s was particularly brutal. It is her personal concern for Josefa and her fellow soldiers that drives Alethia's writing. She was obviously drawn to these women's valor, their patriotism, and their willingness to sacrifice, even to lose their lives. Indeed, the story is intended to, quote, show off their abilities and actions. But if anyone looking back upon Alethia's life is tempted, as indeed her own family and friends were, to place Aletheia within the same category of these women, you must realize that Aletheia herself was not so tempted. Even if she was sometimes oblivious to the similarities between her life and the lives of these women she so admired, she was all too aware of the differences. Aletheia Patterson, adventurer, nonconformist, was still a traditional woman in many ways. Again, that contrary nature of her, that assemblage of values that was so complicated that we talked about last time, was evident in her life in Poland. She admired the women of the Legion Coblette for wearing pants and bob haircuts, but Aletheia herself rarely wore anything but a skirt or dress. In fact, her story devotes an equal amount of space to describing the Legion Coblette's dress and hairstyles as to their valorous deeds. Aletheia did make untraditional choices to work and to live far away from her family in, quite often, dangerous places. But in those faraway places, she generally chose traditionally female roles: teacher, nurturer, caretaker. She wrote, "Looking back over my shoulder, I waved goodbye again, and that was the last time I ever saw Aletheia. Returning one morning from the station, I saw the commandant and a few others in the familiar uniform on their way from the station, having just arrived. They told me sadly, knowing that that would be my first question, that Zerklinska was missing. The Cossacks, unfortunately, had appeared in large numbers. There's a place where we can't read the letter. The part of the line where they were stationed and had broken through. Everyone was fighting. The last they saw of Aletheia was of a Cossack on horseback with a sword in the air over her head. Someone said that he had cut her down, others that she had killed herself. No one seemed to have any hope that she was taken prisoner, and nothing more has ever been heard of her." One of the things Aletheia commented on in her letters was how these women soldiers would leave their children in a kind of daycare and go out fighting the war, and then come back, if they came back, getting their kids. In another article, Modern Exodus from the War Zone, Aletheia's next contribution to the Cincinnati Enquirer of May 22nd, 1921, she detailed the plight of Jews living in Poland and the Ukraine. As they were being forced into exile by the constant pillaging of hordes of troops, Aletheia was living in the midst of armies of Russians, Germans, Austrians, Ukrainians, Poles, and Bolsheviks. As she observed from the village life of Jews making preparations to leave for the promised land of America or Palestine, the Jew's story is told from the point of view of a woman who has little understanding of their religious practices, but who is sensitive to and concerned for their suffering. While the article was apolitical in content, its tone was stirring enough to inspire the newspaper editor to remind his readers not to become too maudlin. The article had been submitted before Congress enacted legislation restricting immigration. So, Aletheia's motive in submitting these stories was fairly clear, with very little reading between the lines. She wanted the United States to get closer to people to understand this suffering. But the U.S. Congress was not listening to people like Aletheia. The legislation that the newspaper editor was referring to was the Emergency Immigration Act of 1921, which was the first time the U.S. had set quotas on immigration. The act restricted the number of immigrants from any country annually to 3% of the number of those immigrants already living in the United States. So I think you can do the math and see that refugees fleeing this part of the southern eastern part of Europe were not going to be represented in any large numbers like more Teutonic, more English immigrants were already in the country. Then the Naturalization Act of 1924 came along and reduced the 3% to 2%. So in the early 20s, Americans were watching what was going on overseas, and they were already saying, we don't want these people over here. Anyway, this time had created in Aletheia a foreign correspondent. In 1920, she left the YMCA and went to work for the Junior Red Cross. Now, when the United States entered World War I, the American Red Cross formed a partnership between itself and American schools called the Junior Red Cross. One of the objectives of this organization was to assist victims and refugees. The National Children's Fund, which is now the American Red Cross Youth Fund, was established with funds contributed by Red Cross youth. And it was supposed to help children caught up in the exigencies of war. Now, kind of temperamental quiet settled in Poland with the Peace of Riga in March of 1921, which lasted roughly until 1923. It ended the Polish-Soviet War and established a border between Poland and Soviet Russia, incorporating parts of Belarus and Ukraine into Poland. With the change in the country, Alethea's work for the Junior Red Cross changed too. She was still a volunteer, but she was working closely with the Red Cross field directors to implement new peacetime programs. Her duties comprised distributing social books, games, and toys, organizing gardening and teaching programs and basket workshops, and directing the formation of other Junior Red Cross clubs. She became a sort of minor celebrity as she drove around the countryside distributing literature, fording flooded roads, which the Model T could do. Watch that little video. Otherwise, I'll just attach it to my highlights video. Taking her meals and shelter at night with Ukrainian peasants or Polish priests. She would take her dog along with her, which acted as her daytime companion and nighttime guardian. She was typically and unusually open-minded in her assessment of European customs, as we can interpret her feelings from her writing. She was not, however, very interested in adopting them. It seems that European political and economic traditions repelled her, but she found certain aspects of European ways of life attractive. She wrote another story in 1922 about little Polish girls who guarded their flocks of geese. Again, it is the romanticism of the subject that draws her to it. There were many Quakers doing relief work in Poland in the early 20s, and Alethea's future friends, Joyce and Sidney Locke, Australians, were working alongside them. The Locks were two foreign journalists who were doing refugee work with the Quakers in Poland when Aletheia met them in the early 1920s. Joyce and Aletheia became close friends in Poland and remained so over the next several decades and several continents. In fact, it was Joyce and Sidney who convinced Aletheia to follow them to their next destination in 1923. In the meantime, Joyce had formed her own opinion of the work Aletheia was doing in Poland, which appeared in the autobiographical book she wrote and published in 1968 called A Fringe of Blue. Here's what she wrote. We met Aletheia Patterson for the first time along the Russian frontier, and I would point out that this good friend of decades still spelled Alethea's name wrong, as everybody did. I think her parents got it right, and after that, it's got right. She was a freelancer in the best sense of the word. She had arrived in Poland a few weeks after the armistice was declared, driving an ambulance which she had driven in France all through World War I. She got that part a little incorrect, but she went to Poland chiefly because she was told that it was impossible to drive across Germany. She distributed pamphlets on the value of breastfeeding babies among people who had never heard of any other way to do it. In addition, they were illiterate. She had had the pamphlets printed in Polish, although the community was entirely Russian-speaking. She was delighted when we ran across her and was giving out milk and chocolates and playing Polish dance records to an entranced audience. We whiled away a few hours with her. She was always most generous in giving help where her interest was roused, and is one of the few friends left with whom I have had constant contact down through the years. Aletheia was reportedly pleased with Joyce's book, but took exception to her friend's depiction of her activities in Poland. She proudly sent copies of A Fringe of Blue to all her own friends, but at least one of them remembers that before sending him the book, Aletheia had first blacked out the passage devoted to her. And actually, she did that on all the copies of the book that she sent to her friends. She bought tons of copies, she sent them out, fact, Joyce Locke is still considered the most, you can see here from a biography of her life, Australia's most heroic woman, and apparently the most decorated woman in Australian history. Oh, here we go. Now, in 1923, oh, there's her book. She had a little fun with Aletheia, and here Joyce is sitting together. This is from Greece a few years later. In 1923, Aletheia went to Greece with the Locks. Joyce was trying to persuade Aletheia of the importance of the work they could do with repatriating Greeks from Asia Minor to help them assimilate themselves into Greek society. Now, what historians recognize now is that this was a mass forced migration, really an expulsion of culturally aligned Greeks from Asia Minor. In 1922, nearly 1.5 million people of Greek descent left Asia Minor, forced out, and hundreds of thousands of Muslims left Greece to go back. After the Greek loss of the Greco-Turkish War, while the move was premised mostly on religious affiliation, the process was really the last stage in creating an ethnically pure Turkey. The repatriation was organized by the League of Nations to help stop ethnic cleansing. So that was their kind of intervention, but it ended up causing a tremendous amount of suffering for millions of people. Now, Joyce Locke's argument convinced Aletheia enough to go and see, at least, what was going on. And in 1923, she left Poland for the northeast portion of Greece. She didn't necessarily know it then, but her time in Poland was at an end. The few days that Aletheia had intended to spend in Greece when she first visited in 1923 ultimately stretched into 20 years, when the League of Nations Refugee Unit asked her to stay and continue her work. The exchange of Greeks and Turkish civilians was bringing thousands of Greeks flooding back into the country. Most of these people were Greek only by ancestry, not by custom, and did not speak Greek. They were without money and had nowhere to go. And a New York Times interview of the period in which Aletheia is described as one of the Americans, quote, who are unselfishly engaged in the task of helping the needy and deserving victims of the war's upheavals, we realize what the cost of this program is. There's a ghost town, one of the towns that was absolutely empty in 1923, still empty today. Thessaloniki, the Aegean gateway to the Balkans, is in the northwest corner of Greece, in the Greek part of Old Macedonia. The city is named for the sister of Alexander the Great, the daughter of Philip of Macedon. Philip, whose palace was found in the town of Armory near Thessaloniki, had his major victory over the Athenians at Thessaly in 338 BC. Just as he was picking up the pieces after the battle, he was informed that his wife had born him a daughter. He named the child Thessaly, and the area is known as Thessaloniki. This is where Aletheia would spend her next 2.5 decades. The anglicized form of Thessaloniki is Salonika, so you'll hear me usually refer to it as Salonika. Aletheia used them interchangeably. Aletheia first arrived in Salonika with Helen Chater, a New Yorker, and together they founded a League of Nations school for refugee children. The campus of whitewashed buildings was in an old army camp, quote, then occupied by 17 families of humans and 1 of pigs. The school later came under the auspices of the British Save the Children's Fund and ultimately operated as one of the Philhellenic schools for refugee children. The Philhellene Center was a vocational school of some 200 to 280 boys and girls. The center organized the production of native crafts that would later be sold to return income to the school, and Aletheia was deeply involved with this. She believed that impoverished Greek children should be taught practical and profitable skills and regularly helped to find buyers for their products among her friends in the States and in Europe. The American Farm School, one of the other organizations for which Aletheia worked and perhaps her best loved years after, was founded by Dr. John Henry House in 1902. On borrowed money, Dr. House had bought some property, put up a school. The school has gone through many, many different iterations and building programs. It still exists today. It still teaches farming practices, modern farming practices, to now boys and girls. For Alethea's lifetime, it was only boys who taught. They offered short courses, short academic courses, among other subjects, community organization, accounting, marketing, and soil conservation. An American Farm School brochure of 1955 stated that 80% of the school's graduates, all males, were farming their own land and sometimes additional rented land. Touting its success. It also had to say that, quote, without exception, they are the most outstanding leaders in their communities in farming, business community activities, and church affairs. The graduates are looked up to by their neighbors, the village officials, the church, and community leaders. All those characteristics were important to Aletheia, and those were the kinds of things she talked about when she would come back to the States and fundraise. Aletheia had once remarked that Greece was inevitable for her. Her grandfather had taught Greek, and she had been named in honor of him. In Greek, Aletheia means truth. Samuel Williams, Alethea's great uncle, was still reading the Bible in the original Greek as a mental diversion at the age of 100. By 1929, the earliest year from her Grecian life for which we have any correspondence, Aletheia was well settled into her life in Salonika. That year, she had just opened a special club room for the girls and was also running a kindergarten for 47 children. It was her personal finances that made her life in Europe possible. She was, as Joyce Locke described her, a, quote, professional volunteer in every sense of the word. And indeed, she did not have to work to afford a seemingly glamorous life in Greece. This fact seemed to support the impression at the American Farm School that she was independently wealthy. Her circumstances did not make her unique, though, as, quote, the school seemed to draw people like that. Bruce Lansdale told me Bruce was her boss, who ran the American Farm School and lived to a very, very ripe old age. I was able to interview him 20 years after his death. Alethea's cousin John Williams, who was president of the Greater Cincinnati Chamber of Commerce when it entered England 27 years ago, recalls that he was considered by his family to be a favorite of Alethea's because his birthday presents were usually somewhat more than a box of pencils. Aletheia was notorious for glamping around Europe, this is how her family back home saw it, and then not really being very generous to her own family. And when I interviewed her two nieces, this was the main complaint they offered, that she would literally give them outdated calendars, like used calendars from God knows what year, or a box of pencils for Christmas. And they grew up to very much dislike their Aunt Aletheia. Alethea's frugality applied to herself. Her car, a Model T, was a great luxury by European standards, but its primary function was to aid her in carrying out her volunteer work. When she did take personal trips in the car, she usually offered rides to other people. Her frugality ended when it came to supporting the causes. Aletheia personally underwrote the cost of school buildings and students' educations. She was also a relentless fundraiser among her friends who remember her as a generous person herself. Her charity work was very much a family affair. Mother, brother, and sister facilitated her ability to carry on her work as much as possible by taking care of her affairs back home in Cincinnati. Besides acting as her proxy, Jack would help solicit aid to Greece among his friends, and in fact, all of her family helped her to organize fundraising efforts, especially during the war and when she came home. Ernestine oversaw the accounts for the sales of Greek embroidery and weaving, the income from which was returned to the school. Many of these items had initially been purchased by Aletheia for herself and sent to the States among her personal belongings, which is probably what she thought about overseas without paying a lot of expenses. Her mother and sister would also make sure that she always had what she needed personally. They frequently sent her care packages of, among other essentials, American chocolates. Though Alethea's letters didn't often mention by name the individuals who benefited from her work in Greece, her reader is somehow cognizant that care of those people is of paramount importance to her. She did often refer to her colleagues at various organizations, but references to specific students appear very infrequently in her letters. Nevertheless, People who survived her in my interview remember that there were always Alethea's boys. She had special favorites, boys in medical school. They were generally kids that she sponsored them. Throughout her many years in Greece, she was remarkably active, especially in light of her age. In the late 1930s, she was already in her 50s, but her energy level was an inspiration to those around her. Everybody I knew told me that. She often went mountaineering with a local club and primitive camping on the mountainsides. She traveled mountains by horseback, negotiating guide fees with, quote, handsome mountaineers. In other words. She traveled around the continent and the Near East, but was most frequently a visitor around the Balkans, usually Serbia and Albania. In one of her mother's letters of the period she wrote to Aletheia, we think of the very most exciting things to do, get the utmost fun out of them. Now, her life in Greece was reasonably quiet and stable in the decade before World War II. She often spent evenings writing a letter home with her on her lap, sharing her bedtime dinner. The literary portraits of the people she encountered appeared frequently during her time in Poland. When she was in Greece, she really didn't write very much about the people she knew and was working with. In the Balkans, she wrote of hearing the men below her window playing checkers and singing the dreary song they seemed to love in the Balkans when a little inebriated. And she was intrigued by the blacks, a nomad race who speak Eastern Romanist languages. There is on occasion a trace of prejudice in her observations, but for the most part, her comments are pleasantly free of the kind of Anglo-centric rant that tended to color the opinions of many travelers of Alethea's time, no matter how cosmopolitan they were. As World War II approached, the deep concern she had felt 20 years before in Poland was evoked again. She had always demonstrated a consciousness of the qualities that she felt made her one a good American, taking care to supposedly convince them herself to know them in others. Certainly, as the political situation in Europe heated up in the late 1930s, these qualities took on a critical importance, as not only Aletheia but other Americans living abroad began, in their concern for themselves, to apply them to others of their acquaintance. Aletheia wrote in 1936, the Jewish couple she had come to know in Salem. He is of Jewish parentage, and she German, but both good Americans of long-standing related come to us. The war began to creep into Alethea's life in insidious ways. She wrote, the war is beginning to be more evident now. Gasoline cars are in use, and gasoline itself has risen to 53 drachmas per gallon, about 35 cents last week. There was no coffee or sugar in the market. Fortunately, I had a little coal, but it cannot be bought except by special permission, but wise people had bought almost enough in most cases last summer. The winter cold of January 1940 crept into Alethea's bones, and she warmed herself with reminiscences of winter spent in other places at other times. Can you think of Finland as we saw it, she wrote, and then think of it as it is now, with the cold at 50 degrees below freezing point, and the northern lights playing the gray, white-clad Finnish soldiers. They surely deserve to remain free. Even here it has been quite cold. Not today, but New Year's Day, before and after 25 degrees below freezing in the mountains. I felt as if I were back in Poland or France, draining the radiator or putting in warm water, going out every 2 hours or less to start the engine and warm it up. Until 1940, Aletheia had managed to avoid the subject of the war in her letters, but now it was impossible. She wrote, Booker is jumping up on my lap. He generally asks very politely, but I had already refused him, so we evidently thought it time to Hitlerize. Speaking of Hitler, they seem to be persecuting the Poles again. One of these men we met said that Poles had been killed for no other reason than holding a letter received from Greece or Romania, so they were afraid to write to their own families. An invasion of Greece was then more than a threat. It was imminent. Still, Alethea's remarks about Greece at the time are never more grave than they are in the above passage. In fact, they are usually much more supercilious. Aletheia, ever the undaunted fundraiser, remarked upon the sales increase her crafters' rugs were enjoying among Germans. In the same letter in which she described the debilitating fear the murders of Polish soldiers had caused, she devoted an equal amount of space to hinting for the gift of a care package of her favorite chocolates. Chocolate mints, plain marshmallows, and chocolate-covered cream caramels. Back home, the newspapers loved local socialites braving the dangers of war-torn Europe to carry on her mission of war relief. Alethea's first suggestion that she would be returning to the United States appeared in spring of 1940, and she kept suggesting it over the next year. Her attitude about the war and its inconveniences was still droll. Quote, I was hoping and expecting to go on a very short excursion to Bulgaria tomorrow, and only today not to go because we do not know what Italy is going to do. Bulgaria is pro-German, and the frontier might suddenly be closed while I am inside, which might be more annoying than exciting. A week later, she had decided not to go until things calmed down. If she could still get a permit, quote, although it perhaps would be too late for the lilacs. She wrote this in May, and she's right, it would have been too late. Conditions in Salonika were still fairly quiet at this point. Aletheia was staying not only because she felt the students needed her, but also because she believed, she told her family, that the war would not touch her heart of Greece. Her continual ambivalence was a source of consternation to her family. Ernestine's desire for Alethea's return was as strong as any, but her letters showed her to have been eminently understanding and sympathetic to her sister, whose appreciation for Alethea's work mitigated the urgency of her request. So she kind of toned it down, whereas Alethea's mother was exactly the opposite. She was getting more and more frantic for Aletheia. When gentle persuasion didn't work, Aletheia phrased her request to her mother to stop worrying a little more strongly. Quote, please, therefore, don't be taken again to the consulate. It makes it look as if I were very infantile, gets them all worked up. So be tranquilized. You know you say you never worry about Aletheia. She will always come out on top. And she signs your loving green dog. Tiny print above the signature, she scrawled, and also. Calm prevailed for a while. Aletheia was staying up late to catch a thief who was after her boat. The thief returning night would be carried off the pier playing by plane. Her students and clubs continued to make supplies for the Greek soldiers to organize special events. Those who stayed in Greece had several lines of defense. And that's what this document refers to. I don't know how well you can do. The American consulate had arranged what they called safe accommodations for Americans living near Salonika. These accommodations were 2 air raid shelters on the property of the American Farm School 8 miles outside Salonika, and one at Anatolia. Aletheia described one as oven-heated and the other as being in a Roman opera. More shelters were later built closer to her. One in the front yard of her apartment building and at the farm school, quote, our air raid shelter there is very good, even cheap. A rug on the floor, a table and chairs, or rather our painted stools, yellow, green, red, made at London School. The American consulate had asked that all Americans stay in the immediate vicinity of the shelters. Referring to that. Aletheia did not oblige that request, as I think you could all predict. Despite the moratorium on travel, or perhaps because of it, Aletheia continued to drive around the country, often to the front lines, ostensibly to deliver supplies, but more often just to see what was going on. As the war heated up, she made sure to use what safety nets were in place and to reassure her family that she was safe. Quote, there are many air raid shelters in town, so none of us is particularly afraid and have become quite used to sprinting to whichever is the nearest shelter. In fact, we all get quite bored sitting or standing in the shelter with nothing to do. Often no light but flashlights, for all electricity is immediately turned off when the siren sounds. The Second World War devastated Greece, but brought out the best in Aletheia. She was now 60 years old, a liability in many people's minds perhaps, but not her own. The family continued to solicit her return more and more fervently with the approach of America's entry into the war. And Aletheia continued to stall. She was energized, working 8 to 12 hours a day and ferrying supplies back and forth to different areas of war-torn Macedonia. This is from the article. Soldiers fighting through snow and flood without stopping to eat. A single pair of socks would save the life of many a one. Relief workers so stoic they continued their efforts after finding their own homes in ruins and their described the work she was now doing. Her career as a relief worker had come full circle. She was back in the business of outfitting desperately needy soldiers. She traveled the countryside in her seemingly ubiquitous and now horribly battered car, collecting knitted garments and what money she could for the soldiers. The Greek government was offering 40 drachmas a pair for socks, about 25 cents. Aletheia found herself knitting socks for the soldiers and experimenting with inventing a new kind of sock, which was actually an oblong piece of flannel that would be wrapped around the foot, and she was even thinking of patenting it. There's no sign that ever happened. Bombs were now falling with some frequency in the Salonika sector, but Aletheia's work continued unabated. The Associated Press called her fearless in relief work. At some point during the war, Aletheia decided to venture off on one of her famous trips to Athens, but was frustrated by the circuitous path she had to take to get there. The conventional road to Athens required a 3,000-foot ascent into the mountains, with subsequent descent to sea level, a total of 4 times. The train instead went past Mount Olympus and through a tunnel, avoiding the annoying climbs through the mountains for a nice, fairly smooth trip. Aletheia decided if the train could take the tunnel, she could too. She drove her car up to and on and along the tracks and straight through the train tunnel. When she was asked what she would have done if the train had come through the tunnel from the other side, she answered that the train would have had to go back. Bombs were falling heavily on Salonika in January of 1941. Quote, "The Italians seemed to say, 'What a lovely day it is. Let's go bombing,'" Aletheia wrote in January. In April, she cabled her family. "Escaped from Salonika, just returned from the Albanian front, remaining for President in Athens, British lines then broke, and Nazis entered Athens on the 17th of April." Now by that point, Italian bombing raids had demolished 1/5 of the homes and businesses of Salonika. But word reached those in Athens, Aletheia among them, that the town had not been further devastated by the Nazis when they occupied Salonika shortly thereafter. The Nazis had, however, converted the American Farm School campus into a compound and were holding prisoners of war there. As the bombing intensified, Aletheia was finally compelled to take refuge away from the city in the mountains. Her German friends were being forced to leave the country altogether, and her family's letters, as well as her own, were being censored. These otherwise intimidating developments served only to cause offense, not concern, for Aletheia, particularly when the censor asked the Pattersons to shorten their letters and clean up their handwriting. And as those of you who heard the first talk know, Aletheia was thrashed for her terrible handwriting by her own father. So apparently she wasn't the only one bad handwriting family. When she returned to Salonika, she found life there quite changed. The American Farm School newsletter that circulated in the States in 1942 carried a letter written by Charles House to American patrons of the school, describing conditions at the school when the Nazis took possession of it the year before. When, at the time of his writing, the farm school staff had already been embroiled in the war in Europe for 3.5 years. From her first work abroad in World War I, Aletheia's movements had concerned her family, and then the American consulate. Now, she began to concern the Nazis. During the early part of the occupation, Aletheia was notoriously successful in circumventing Nazi regulations. Technically, she needed permits to travel throughout the Salonika sector, but when the permits weren't forthcoming, she went anyway. Quote, "My lodgings were in the back of the lines. Each night I would drive down to the front. I wore a soldier's helmet and just kept on going whether there was a raid or not. But I was lucky and was not harmed." These trips to the front lines were never mentioned in her letters to her family because she didn't want to aggravate their anxiety. Her friends at the farm school, though, were all well aware of her daring. One told me, "You know, you got arrested for things like that, but that didn't bother her." I was her old boss. If she got stopped at a roadblock, she would feign helplessness. And helplessness combined with her petite stature and soft voice usually worked to get her where she wanted to go. In fact, she was able to maneuver around almost everything until the Nazis arrested her. It was May of 1941. Aletheia was just returning from Athens after a raid. Her cellophane-wrapped car, American flag waving in front, pretty gutsy, passed overturned tanks, Greek soldiers returning home, and columns of Germans. The American consuls had been asked by the Nazis to leave Greece after the United States government had asked German officials to leave the U.S. And only two attaches had remained behind the American farm school. Aletheia had been working with one of them to prepare her visa to return home. One day, en route to see the attaché, she stopped by the office of a fellow boat club member to ask his help. I love that she's still in the boat club, in the middle of it. To ask his help in finding her boat, which had been recently lost in a storm. There were two men in the office, one the younger brother of the consular office, and the other unknown to her. After they left, while she waited there alone, several Nazis came in, and one of them accused her of having brought a British officer to the office. He said, "You can't go yet," in perfectly good English. "You are staying here. You are in a pretty mess now. You have brought a British soldier here." She replied, quote, "Indeed I did not. When I came to this office, I brought no one. Younger Mr. L and I, the other man I took to be another Greek member of the boat club, we were the only ones here when you came in." Aletheia was, of course, fond of British soldiers, which they knew, and had once cited wanting to meet some as a reason for going to Athens. In her 60s, she gives me some inspiration here. She used to have wanted to meet men in the middle of the war, but she's absolutely forbidden to do any of this, and possibly going through a drink when to do it. All of this stuff had inspired the Nazis' interest in her for some time, clearly. Her protestations of innocence were ignored, and the Nazis imprisoned her for 10 days. The prison was more of a sort of guardhouse for wayward German soldiers, where Aletheia ate better food than she had since the war started. She got meat, cheese, olive oil, and butter. She got along well with her jailer. Herr Hans, she called him, and with her fellow inmates, including two Greek women who were accused of the same crime and cried from the time they were incarcerated until the time Aletheia was released. Aletheia refused to cry as she felt it was undignified and thought it would make her appear to be guilty. Ultimately, she was released when her accuser's case rested upon her having supposedly hosted British soldiers in her house. She rebutted by pointing out to them that she had no house. This was an effective conversation stopper, and Aletheia was released with an apology from her jailers, an apology she would treasure for the rest of her life. In the end, it was a trick then director of the farm school, Charles House, played on Aletheia that forced her to return to the United States. He and his wife Anne were now quite worried about her. They too were anticipating a U.S. entry into the war. Merely asking Aletheia to go home would never have worked, as we all know, from learning something of her character. But House, who was really familiar with her country history, that quality that Joyce Locke once suggested motivated Aletheia to go to Poland via Germany because you can't do it. He decided to manipulate her into deciding to go to Athens on her own, knowing that she would never be able to get back to Salonika once she got there. Aletheia was then staying with the Houses, and when Charles came home for lunch one day, he casually mentioned to Aletheia that he had heard the Germans were not issuing any permits to Athens. When she pressed for more information, House told her he didn't know much else. He had simply heard that no more permits were being issued. Aletheia appeared triumphantly at the luncheon table the next day, a permit to Athens signed by the Germans clutched in her hand. Having a permit was one thing, House suggested. Actually getting there was another. That was enough. The gauntlet had been thrown down. That was all she needed, you see. So she got herself to Athens. Only once she got there did she realize what Charles had done to her, that she could not get back home to Salonika. So once she got to Athens, her fate was sealed. She had no other option but to go home. From Athens, she made her way to Rome, then to Lisbon, and when the ocean liner Excambian departed for New York on September 19, 1941, Aletheia was on it. The Excambian was one of 4 passenger cargo liners: the Excalibur, the Exporta, the Exeter, and the Excambian, built in New Jersey by American export lines during World War II. Then the U.S. Navy appropriated them and turned them into troop ships and renamed them. And here you get to see this was the line Commercial Line brought her to New York, where she took in some plays before she went on to Cincinnati. And then safely back in her house at 5 Dexter Place, she began her stateside relief work immediately. Now, her Blue Book upbringing came in handy because she was going to solicit all her wealthy friends to contribute to her causes. She got businessmen and wives of important businessmen and to support a clothing collection center for grief relief in Cincinnati. The store opened in 1943 at 136 West 7th Street and saw a healthy turnover of goods, an impressive feat during wartime rationing. While she was overseas, Aletheia had frequently written to her mother to request that he send, or her brother to request that he send some of her money to Greece, and that continued. Now she was running the store, and those funds were going back. She orchestrated the presentation of a Greek living frieze at the Women's Club and donated the first books on Greece to their library. She aided her own country's war effort by entering the American Red Cross Motor Corps. Again, she's in her 60s. It's pretty cool. She also worked in the USO, but most of her time and thought, however, was devoted to the Greek war relief. That's what her family had to say about that. Now, the Germans had occupied Greece for a little more than 3 years, leaving in early 1944. Aletheia's friend at the farm school, Theolitzis, chronicled what had taken place at the school in the last days of German occupation. One episode of the war that involved Litzis and Aletheia became American farm school legend. Throughout the course of her refugee work, Aletheia's automobile had become more than a luxury. It had become a necessity for doing her relief work. Early in the war, the Red Cross had made use of the car, and when the Germans began to move on Greece, the question of what to do to keep the car safe from them arose. Cars at that time were few, and she knew hers would soon be seized by the Nazis for their own use. She didn't want to sell or give the car away because she intended to use it again when the war ended, which she always minimized the length of. She always underestimated how long that war would last. So Litzis came up with this plan for her. The car would be dismantled and each part hidden somewhere around the school. The whereabouts of all the parts would remain unknown to anyone, including Aletheia. Litzis would be the only one to know. Legend around Salonika had the car parts scattered all across the farms in the area, when in reality they were all on school grounds. They stayed there for 4 years until Aletheia returned to Greece. According to Bruce Lansdale, her former boss, the first question she had when she returned was for her friend Theo. "Where's my car?" Litzis replied that he would produce the car within 2 days. He disinterred all the pieces of the car, and 2 days later, Aletheia was off on her first errands of the post-war era. She wrote home, "The other day, the director of public welfare and the inspector of the children's station, as they call it, came up. Perhaps I wrote you. Anyway, the children all look very sweet and demure in their little white aprons made out of sacks that supplies had been shipped in. The advertisement on a sack still showing. We are going to dye them. The aprons French blue after much discussion. I was against khaki. They say red is too much the color of communism. Gray would be a little monotonous. Brick, a little unusual." That was a letter to her mother in 1946. 1959 and 61 brought 2 important tributes to Aletheia. The first honor came on August 16, 1959, as Aletheia and Ernestine sat on the dais in Owensville, Ohio, as the town paid homage to the county's most famous son, John M. Patterson. The occasion was the dedication of the town's new markers honoring the 43rd governor of Ohio. Sorry, these are some more of her eyewitness reports. On May 27, 1961, the American Farm School dedicated their new Cincinnati Hall, which Aletheia had underwritten. Aletheia was never an expatriate. Again, she was truly dedicated to the idea of spreading democracy overseas. She never assimilated herself into Greek culture. Her life was really one of a well-traveled European tourist who, having landed in Greece, decides to permanently curtail the rest of her trip. Most of Aletheia's friends in Greece were either American or English, and her command of Greek must have suffered for it. Because after having studied Greek at college, being the granddaughter of a Greek professor, and having lived in Greece for more than 20 years, she still needed a translator for the speech she gave at the dedication at the farm For the last decade of her life, from the last decade of her life, comes one of Alethea's friends' favorite stories about her, one that any student of her life will see as completely characteristic. While strolling in her yard at Dexter Place one day, she took a fall and broke her hip. When she was discovered there several hours later, she was asked if she happened to panic at having fallen while alone. She replied that she hadn't really been concerned because trash collection was coming around in a couple of days, and she was sure one of the collectors would have spotted her lying there on his way through the yard to pick up the cans. Aletheia died in 1978. Oh, sorry. There are some dedication pictures. Her with some of her best friends, Greece, and artwork, I believe, in school. Here she is in the middle of the time shoot. More friends from the farm school, including the locks. Oops.
Cincinnati Hall was in Greece, is that correct? You showed the sign for Cincinnati Hall. That's a
Yes,
Greek.
that's at the farm school. And in her time, there were streets named for her in Saloniki. I tried to find, I think they were long since her name, but in her lifetime they were there. She died in 1978, but her legacies can still be found. Here she is at her cabin here, Claremont County. Perhaps the most generous and tangible of her contributions was made just a few years before her death, and her gifts to the people of Claremont County. The first of these was a tract of land of approximately 40 acres along US 50, now known as Patterson Park. She made the gift in honor to the county in which her father was born, and in which she enjoyed a happy childhood. She had inherited the property from her uncle Louis Patterson, and in 1976 she made the district a second gift of a little under 17 acres and a rustic lodge. She loved his cabin. She established the Patterson Foundation before her death for the purpose of supporting capital projects for the Park District. And I would have to add that she did all of this work with the aid of a very, very skilled attorney, Louis Gatch, who is still with us. And I spoke to him a couple of times over the last few months, and we absolutely get well. She was an important client of his and also a friend. No obituary could sum up the meaning of Aletheia Patterson's 97 years on earth, or describe her strength of character as concisely as she did herself in her gift to the Park District. Concerned with the rapid development she saw all around her, she determined to preserve Claremont County's land as close to the way she had found it, if not better than she had found it, when she entered the world 9 decades plus before. The tremulous hand that relied her inner strength, she laid out the following 3 provisions for the parks on buff linen Dexter Place stationery. The park was to be a serious place, quote, not to be an amusement park. It was to be a place of contemplation, not competition. Quote, no field such as baseball, football. The park would be a safe haven for all creatures. Quote, no hunting, nor shooting, nor trap shooting. Like her similar gift of Scarborough Woods, which she gave to the city of Cincinnati. The park was, quote, to be used as bird and tree preserve. As a final tribute to the memory of her father, she penned her last caveat: no liquor to be sold. Thank you very much for your attention. That's the lodge is up now. With funds from the Patterson Foundation. Any questions?
How about that video you promised?
Oh, you want to see video? Any questions first?
Where did she get her money?
Well, her family had money. Her dad was the president of Union Pacific Life Insurance. It's a pretty big establishment in downtown.
professors are not overweight.
Some aren't. Okay, so. Oh, thank you. I thought I was doing that.
It's difficult to do when you're there.
Any questions while Matt's finding that video?
She was in the driver's seat to the end.
Yeah.
Literally and figuratively.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know what she thought about cars before she went to the mechanic school, but she knew clearly that was the way that she could get to do what she wanted to do, was getting the skills and getting that license. And it worked for a lot of them.
Not having to walk.
Not having to walk, but being powered by the car. I mean, I wonder how many other women at the time thought that.
Was her mom's side?
Yes, on her mother's side, her mother's father taught me at Western University. You passed it, I saw, it was the color. No, he actually got past that part, he's on it, so go, scroll up. I think so, I saw the, yeah, try. Go, put, is that story? Well, maybe you have to scroll down, I'm sorry. Otherwise, we can probably just Google, Model T, Greenfield Village.
What was it called?
It's Model T, Greenfield Village driving test.
Model T, what was it?
Greenfield Village. There you go, Model T Village. I don't know if that'll bring up the test that I saw with her actually. She's got a driver, he's showing exactly how you set the car. No, I think we probably have to see if I can find it.
Airlines are important.
It was fun though. Especially because it's somewhat prophetic too, that it was a female driver who was learning, and the woman who knows how to operate a car in the village says to her, yeah, so that's what it is. And you have that page up.
What's it? I didn't see.
All right. Yes. Red Cross. Yeah.
Okay, so it was a Red Cross initiative that she was aligned to and helped meet with and just went delivering supplies and everything.
Well, what it looks like is that General Pershing actually sent the Red Cross to Poland. And nobody in the United States was thinking about it, wanted this Bolshevik revolution to go this building. We don't have containment theory in 1921, but that's what we're talking about. They did not want that revolution spreading further. So they wanted to support the Poles to hold it back.
And so she went there and she just joined the Red Cross. So there was no official
Well,
travel. She just seems such an amazing woman to be able to travel as these lines and to get in there.
Well, again, she went because someone told her she couldn't. She was working with the Red Cross in France, and there was this initiative to go to Poland, and she wanted to make her car, and they told her she couldn't cross Germany. So she took her car and crossed Germany and then came back, and picked up her brother, and then went back again. So her contrary street was pretty pronounced, but I think she had fun. She had fun in these war zones. Maybe like Promont was $2.
You seem to have been all over the place. No one asked for a green card or documentation, because she was a wealthy American.
She had that Polish passport.
She had a Polish passport, but the other thing is, that Alethea's life might, I hadn't thought about this before, but it might prove something that, a lot of older women say today, that they are ignored, they are invisible. A lot of gray-haired women will say, we are invisible, we can sit at the restaurant trying to get the waiter's attention, we can, do lots of things, to try to draw attention to our needs, but nobody pays attention to us. Well, I remember, reading that could be a distinct advantage if one were a spy.
Okay.
Which might be why the Nazis were looking at her. Good old lady goes around town all the time, nobody challenges where she goes, what she's doing. And she's clearly hanging with British officers, but she's hanging with British officers because she liked to be around handsome men. She liked the company. So. What do you think? Yeah.
Where were you finding first? I was able to see the first, lecture, thank you. Yes, where were you finding? You just mentioned it maybe.
The papers?
Your video.
Oh, yeah, where is that?
It is on the Claremont County Historical Society YouTube. Just type in Claremont County Historical Society, it's the most recent video.
Thank you.
No problem.
Anything else?
Somebody, Patterson Park, on Route 50, how far out can things beyond the valley? Yeah, 75.
Oh, just take 222, right up from here. Just off of 222, turn right, and it's right on your left. Actually, they have both sides of the road.
And it's roughly 57 acres, you said 40 acres plus 17, and then there's Stafford Park.
Yeah, that's the one, she gave the city of Cincinnati one too. And I believe that's the little one in, O'Brienville.
Oh,
Yeah. Starville Park.
probably.
But, I don't know how we got one. Well, honestly, the property out here is much less expensive than the property anywhere within the bounds of the city of Cincinnati.
East Point, trying to imagine what, Belmont must have like, built in 1860.
My grandma, so that was her family farm. so-
They did not build it, they bought it.
Oh, yeah, but whoever built it,
Yeah.
I'm assuming if you wanted to go to town, it would be following the little Miami to the Ohio, basically.
Streetcar. Streetcar. That's how,
Streetcar.
that is what started suburbanization. Period, end of story. Streetcars, public transportation enabled people who wanted to work in downtowns to live outside the downtown, because more and more downtowns, just like we saw with Rust Belt cities later in the century, were always seen as dens of iniquity.
I'm sorry, cities.
Yes.
The city was always the den of iniquity. The city had the gambling joints and the saloons and prostitutes and all those things, and people who lived in rural areas, always held themselves above that standard.
In church.
Yeah,
That's right. In
and
church.
church,
Uh-huh.
yeah. So, and you know this because you still hear it today, you go to red state and hear arguments about the iniquitous blue states, those densely urban places, New England or what have you, full of immigrants. Those arguments are very, very old. Yeah. Anything else?
Was there negative press about Aletheia for all her gallivanting and her unmarriedness and
No, there wasn't. And that's why the Park District commissioned this piece of work. They had no idea she'd done all this stuff.
oh wow. So nothing scandalous for you to deliver to us. Nothing scandalous at all.
I could make something up. Well, I don't, I mean, in her own day, I think she had crushes on men and women both. It was quite clear. I think there are reasons why she chose not to marry, the same reasons that 50% of college educated women at the time chose not to get married, that divorce was a big question mark. I mean, marriage, the success of it, was the big question mark that it still is today. You know, am I making the right decision? Tie myself to this person for life. But the consequences of making a mistake in her day were much more severe than they are now. And one of the reasons that I was talking about divorce and the laws and how they evolved was not just because that first talk was actually written for Women's History Month. When I got sick in March, I was just beginning that during Women's History Month, so I wondered what Women's history in there. It's also because at least 6 states are now contemplating and have introduced legislation to repeal no-fault divorce. So everybody should know that.
If somebody looks at rock, don't come knocking. She got her board.
Yeah. So, scandal maritime. Alethea's name is not even in our index at CCHS, at the Historical Society. She's probably the most prominent female from a county of her era, possibly most of the 20th century, but it doesn't appear, you know, because men archivists who typically indexed, created finding aids for these people did not include women. So they may be talked about in stories, but these stories weren't in our files. These stories were preserved by her. That's how we found them.
So has there been any other scholarly work on her that you're aware of besides your history?
You know, and you know how scholarly mine is available. That's why I had to write all that context for the last talk you all were guinea pigs for. Because I didn't do it at the time, which I should have. Didn't have time. I was in grad school, but in writing it, I found it kind of electrifying to read about. I remember this at the time, finding a study that said that almost 50% of women at the time didn't marry, and thinking, well, that can't be right. But then I sent it to college educated women, and trying to abbreviate everybody. But it's more studies than that. But again, some of the studies I cited, those were studies by women sociologists. Sociology was a brand new field. So it was, you know, a new gender doing the studies, and it was a new field. And all that stuff was most likely largely discredited by the establishment at the time. So, you know, talk up women, because nobody's done it in most of human history. Anything else? Yeah.
I'm a docent at Belmont,
Uh-huh.
and just having been to both lectures now, I will be able to interject some of her story with John Patterson.
Oh, good. Good. You know, I've never had the tour at Provo. I have.
Time's wasted.
Yes. You know what always happens. You live in New York City your whole life, you never even looked at the Statue of Liberty, you know. No, I need to actually take the tour, but I didn't know how much you presented about. Is there a portrait of Aletheia, a painting portrait there by any chance? I saw one on
There's
Dad,
some
her brother.
photographs. There's some photographs because they did have, they utilized cameras. They had their own cameras. So they're in the art photo archive. There's a lot. We don't have a lot on display. There's a few photographs of her and her sister Ernestine and brother Jack, but not like the portrait.
I see.
But anyway, we're hoping first and third Sunday every month.
Go.
1 to 4 in the afternoon.
1 to 4, first and third Saturday.
Yes.
Yeah, and that, I think Randy, you might have been, you said seeing that house at the time, did you mean the interior? Because that house is really pristinely preserved from exterior as well. I mean, that is a classic Tuscan villa style house of the mid-19th century.
Stone on stones.
That's true. That's true. No ripping off the vinyl siding and putting up new. Yeah.
So the Patterson family bought Provo, and that was Alethea's father? When he was governor, or?
No, because he became governor in 1906, and the house was bought in the No, and I should point out, done from his home.
Yes.
I mean, done from his sick bed, which is pretty challenging. Yeah.
Before the internet.
Before we, exactly, you could just type it in. Yeah, no, I developed a great respect for her parents in reading all these letters. And kind of loved her dad. I love that her dad wasn't, you know, her mom was the worrier and her dad poked out her